I'm Terence Broad. I'm Senior Lecturer at CCI, currently the Acting Course Leader for the Data Science and AI for the Creative Industries Masters. Been working here for the last few years, but I've also, before that, my background was in creative computing. So I did an undergraduate, BSc and Masters in Creative Computing at Goldsmiths between 2012 and 2016. I took a couple of years out and then I went and did a PhD at Goldsmiths in AI in the computing department, where I was doing a lot of work with practice and generative systems. So the talk today is really a summary of the PhD, which I submitted in November. So I started in 2018, submitted it in 2024, and then I had my Viva 3 weeks ago at Goldsmiths. So this talk is going to be kind of the whole overview of what's in the thesis, following mostly the same structure. So the very start of the PhD is a joke, is a quote from this, someone who posted this on Twitter in 2017, Chet Hayes. And the joke is, a machine learning algorithm walks into a bar, the bartender asks, "What do you have?" And the algorithm says, "What's everyone else having?" And I think this kind of sums up how machine learning works. We basically give machine learning algorithms data that we've collected, data that we've labeled, and we get it to sort of imitate the data, imitate the labels from human authors. And most of the developments in machine learning and in deep learning in the last 10 years has been through imitation-based learning, especially in the generative AI space. So that applies to all kinds of machine learning, but in the context of generative AI, this paradigm of imitation-based learning has been very successful. We may be running out of chairs. There's more chairs in 120. Maybe we could grab some. Yeah. So. Yeah. Just let people get settled. Yeah. So generative AI in the last sort of 10 years has been very successful in lots of different domains. So using data, training data, using imitation-based learning algorithms, we can generate photorealistic images of people. We can generate realistic audio that sounds just like recorded music, and we can generate realistic video now. And this is sort of really astonishing. It's the majority of the things that I teach to my students. But to train these models, you need a lot of data, and actually to make these models bigger and bigger, to make them higher and higher fidelity, you need more and more data. And we've got to the point now where the companies that are building and training the most sophisticated models are trying to get as much data as they possibly can, and we're getting to the point now where some of these models are being trained on almost all the data has ever been generated in human history within certain domains. It's kind of astonishing. You know, the language models are now, being trained on all of this data from the internet, but we're also getting all the books that have ever been written. All this kind of stuff is all being fed into these models to make them more and more sophisticated. But with that has come, a real backlash against this, because in order to get higher fidelity models and get more and more data, these companies are not getting consent for the data, they're not licensing the data. In lots of cases, they're just scraping it from the internet, and in some cases, doing more egregious forms of pirating as well on top of that. So we've had backlash from artists, we've had backlash from more established players in the creative industries against AI. And there was this statement called the AI training statement. It's got about 50,000 signatures of people working in the creative industries that says the unlicensed use of creative works for training generative AI is a major unjust threat to the livelihoods of the people behind those works and must not be permitted. So we're now at a point where, these worlds, the creative industries and the people training these generative AI systems are really kind of at loggerheads. And our degree currently is called AI for the Creative Industries, but we're going to rename it next year to something else, because that has become quite a loaded thing in and of itself, just that term. So that's the kind of current contemporary context. But I had a much earlier encounter with kind of intellectual property, copyright, and generative AI. So when I was doing my research masters in creative computing at Goldsmiths, between 2015 and 2016, it was just as deep learning and generative AI was just kind of becoming a thing. You know, GANs were starting to take off, variational autoencoders. So I did this project. I spent about a year working on it with a very, very early version of TensorFlow, which was very difficult to use. But I trained an autoencoder model, and we were looking at videos. I was doing lots of other different things, and out of kind of boredom one weekend, I was like, I'm just going to try and train this on Blade Runner, see what happens. So I got all of the frames from the film Blade Runner and used that as a training data set. And it's about 200,000 frames, something like that. I trained an autoencoder model to process each frame and reconstruct it. And then after training it, I trained it for 6 epochs on like a 4 gig RAM GPU. It took me a month to train at home, and after training it for a month, I was then able to reconstruct the film. So I passed each frame of the film back through the model and made this reconstruction. So at the time, I was more interested in, okay, we'll train it on Blade Runner, but then we could put other videos through this and see what one video looks like through another video, that kind of thing. It seemed like an interesting way of making videos, but I also made a full reconstruction of this original Blade Runner film and put it online. And that seemed to be the thing that people were most interested in, found most compelling. And I wrote a blog about this. I put it on like the machine learning subreddit. Hey, there's more chairs in room 120. You might need to go grab some. Yeah, okay. So I wrote a blog about this, and then I put it on like the machine learning subreddit, and it got some traction on the machine learning subreddit. But then someone posted it on Hacker News, and it was like on the front page of Hacker News for a few days, and that was where it really picked up. But it was sort of trending online for a bit, my blog on Medium, and then Warner Brothers issued a copyright takedown notice of the film. So I just put the full 2-hour reconstruction of the film on Vimeo, and after about 4 or 5 days, it got served this Digital Millennium Copyright Act takedown notice and removed from Vimeo. And I felt like a complete tool at the time. I was sort of like, well, obviously that was going to happen, and I just felt like I've wasted a lot of effort on this work. But then my blog was still up, and it still had the embedded videos in, and it had, this video's been taken down by Warner Brothers on the embedding of my blog. And so a journalist from the website Vox got in touch with me and then was like, oh, I think this is really interesting that they've taken it down. And she interviewed me, and I was just like, oh, well, this is a new kind of approach, No one really knows if it's copyright infringement or not. Like, I'm not a lawyer, but, it was just a research project. I'm just a student. I wasn't trying to steal from Warner Brothers. And Blade Runner is a film all about kind of artificial memories and cyborgs and that kind of thing. So it seemed like the film that was the obvious film to do this with to me at the time. But she wrote this article. She then got in touch with Warner Brothers for comment, and they rescinded the takedown notices, probably because they didn't want the bad PR. So then she wrote this blog, this article on Vox, a guy trained in machine learning, a machine to watch Blade Runner, and then things got seriously sci-fi, and this went absolutely massive. I think it had 3 million reads, something like that. And after that point, I then just started getting emails from curators of museums and galleries asking me to show this video in upcoming exhibitions, which was amazing. So within the space of kind of finishing the project in May, by October 2016, the work was being exhibited in the Whitney Museum of American Art, which was my first ever art exhibition. It was quite a surreal experience. So this kind of interaction with copyright and all this kind of stuff was the thing that made everyone really interested in the work and gained a lot of prominence. But at the same time, it was something that didn't necessarily sit that well with me. And I remember flying on the plane to New York to go to the opening of this exhibition, and I was absolutely shitting myself because I was just thinking, they're going to take it down, they're going to stop me at the work being an exhibition, And obviously it didn't, the curators at the Whitney, when I told them this, were just laughing. They were like, nobody sues the Whitney, don't worry about it. But then, it was the work was shown in the Barbican, it was shown at Ars Electronica, it was shown lots of places all over the world. And before every exhibition, I just had this deep feeling in my stomach. I was like, I'm going to get a cease and desist letter from Warner Brothers, and then the exhibition's going to be called off and all this kind of stuff. So it was a huge amount of stress for many years, just having done this work. And Warner Brothers, they rescinded the original takedown notice, but they've reissued it like 3 months later, you know, and I recently got another one for the video that I just showed you at the start. So 9 years later, they're still kind of issuing these takedown notices on this work. So this was kind of interesting, and I think it was very instructive to me early on that this was something that I didn't want to do again. So I wanted to continue making art with generative AI. I wanted to incorporate that in my artistic practice, but you know, I didn't want to be sued by a multinational organization for one thing, and I also didn't want, just on a more sort of less from the legal side of things, but just generally it didn't really sit very well with me that I'd taken a film without the consent of someone else and used it, you know, kind of to train a model, derive value from it, derive interest from it, you know, leaning on that brand recognition, and use that to make my art again. And so I kind of, since 2016, I haven't trained a generative model on someone else's data for making art, at least not without their consent and that kind of thing. So it's something, since 2016, that was kind of what I was thinking. I was like, I want to find a way of doing this where I'm not just imitating other people's data, deriving value from other people's creative labour. In 2017, there was a paper called Artificial Intelligence's Fair Use Crisis, where a legal scholar wrote about the work and said that, you know, while it's not obviously not trying to sort of compete with the film directly, in terms of like current copyright legislation in America, this would probably be considered a derivative work. And anything, you know, the model would be a derivative work, and then anything generated by the model would be derivative after that. So I've spoken to other lawyers since who've said that actually, you know, that I would have maybe potentially, you know, you have sort of exemptions from copyright in terms of like pastiche and parody and this kind of thing. So there might be examples of this where this work in this particular context, because the film was about artificial memories and artificial intelligence in the first place, it's more of a commentary on the film than just me just ripping it off to try and make money. But at the same time, it's not something I wanted to do. And I'm trying to figure this out at the moment, but I think I was the first person in the world to have been involved in a copyright dispute with a generative AI output. I think. I'm still trying to fact check that. But yeah, definitely one of the first. So this kind of got me thinking around 2017 was, how do I train a generative model without imitating data, without imitating someone else's work? How can I do something else with it? And, you know, we can talk about imitating, but, you know, pastiching, mimicking, parroting, copying, stealing other people's data, deriving value from it. These are all things that I wanted to do something else than with generative neural networks. I thought neural networks are very interesting. I just didn't think that this approach was something I wanted to do again. So I started my PhD in 2018, and it spent best part of a year trying to wrangle with this question, which was how to train a generative model without imitating data. And I was, you know, going really deep into stats and information theory and cognitive science and, you know, computational neuroscience, trying to sort of find ways of doing this. And I got really stuck, and I hit a sort of roadblock. And then in the end, I kind of realized that what I was trying to do was trying to train a model without modeling data, which is an oxymoron. You know, you can't model something, you can't produce a model of something without modeling the data that you're training it on. So in the end, I kind of reformulated this and started to think, okay, how do I just push these networks away from the existing data that's been trained on? And again, I've been looking, at the start of my PhD, I was looking at like very formal maths and trying to do this in the sort of proper machine learning way, where you derive equations from certain statistical principles or mathematical principles. But in the end, it just wasn't working for me. And, you know, I was an artist. I was also, my background was creative computing and, you know, doing creative practice-led work with software and computer technology. And so I ended up just starting to think, okay, I'm just going to not follow the sort of normal conventions that are common in machine learning, and I'm just going to start trying to break these things and play around with them in a more free and expressive way. And so the approach was really this idea of hacking, where you're taking technology and trying to use it in ways that it's not originally designed for. And that was the approach that started to work for me, where I started to make progress with this. So the PhD really is centered around 3 chapters of experimental work, and I'll talk through them one by one. The first experiment was this simple premise that I had, which was, would it be possible to train a generative neural network without data? So obviously I'd been stuck with, how do you train something to not model data, to not model something using data, and then I thought, well, what if we just get rid of data completely from the process? That way, I'll find some way of training something to do something, but if there's no data in the original process, then whatever the outputs are has to be kind of novel, original, something that not based on a prior existing data set. So at the time, GANs were the most popular approach to this. How many people know what GANs are and are familiar with them? Okay, I'll give a very quick kind of summary. In a GAN, you have these 2 networks. You've got a generator and a discriminator. The generator is sort of being given, random inputs, just random numbers, and it's producing images. It doesn't really know what the images are supposed to look like, but the discriminator is trying to classify real data, real training images, and then generated images, and it's trying to tell which ones are the real data, which ones are the fake generated ones, and that's what the discriminator is trying to do, and the generator is trying to trick the discriminator. So it's trying to optimize the discriminator to produce things that it thinks are fake. Things are real, sorry. So this is a very successful strategy for training generative AI models. And StyleGAN kind of came out late 2018, it was published in 2019. And so this came out, and this was the model that I started to play around with. So I was working with the original StyleGAN, and my idea for how to train a model without data was to take the GAN training regime, and I'll just get rid of the training data, and I just put 2 generators in there. So the discriminator is still doing this binary classification. The generators are still trying to trick the discriminator into a false classification. But we just don't have any data in this process. So we're starting with these networks that are randomly initialized and then training them just to imitate each other. So I tried this, and it wasn't particularly interesting. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is the sort of output of the 2 generators across a series of steps. And essentially, after the training run, the results don't really change very much from what it looks like from its original setting. And it just very quickly led to mode collapse. So it wasn't very interesting. The network was just generating a single output, basically, that was not really the point of these networks. The point of these networks is they generate lots of stuff. So I then came up with this idea of trying to get these networks to compete with each other to produce more colors than the other one. So it's the training loss is still just based within the system and the dynamics between the models, but these networks are trying to produce more colors than the other one in its kind of output batch of training in a sort of pixel space. And this then was much more interesting. So if you train this, it started to move away from the what was originally trained on, and would quite quickly sort of, in the process of about 10 minutes of training, moved into these quite nice abstract forms. I then did a series of experiments where I instead of using the adversarial loss, I was messing around with different kinds of loss functions, so cosine distance, Euclidean distance, and then lots of permutations of all of those different ones. So I did a series of training experiments, and each one was sort of a slightly different variation and came up with slightly different outputs in the result. What I'm showing you here is the sort of work I did last summer in retracing my steps in order to get more sort of data and figures in the thesis. When I originally did this was the outputs of the results. Unfortunately, it was so long ago that I'd lost a lot of data through hard drive disk failures and this kind of thing. So if anyone is doing a PhD, I'd recommend trying to keep a good backup of all your data so you don't have to redo all your work in the write-up stage. So this was the original works. They look a bit different from the ones that I just showed you, but the principle's the same. Each one was a different variation of these loss functions, and they all produce these abstract things. And so I made a series of artworks where I was doing like a latent space interpolation of the two generator networks in synchrony. And I think one of the things that was most surprising about this was just how kind of tasteful the sort of colour schemes of the outputs were. I don't really understand why that is the case. And in a way, I quite like the sort of mystery of it, that it's, lots of people think that I've trained it on like Rothko paintings. Like I've got into arguments literally with people about this, whether like you've trained it on, you know, colour field paintings and artists from colour field. I'm like, no, I didn't. There's no data. Like this has just come out of sort of the dynamics of these networks and random initialization, and people really don't like to believe me on that one. So I remember showing this to a professor at Goldsmiths called Matthew Fuller, and he was just really, really annoyed how tasteful these these were for an AI model. So it's kind of, this was like aesthetically interesting. I thought, you know, I really liked the sort of the outputs of the works, but I was not very happy with kind of how simple the things were. It's nice kind of aesthetically and artistically, but I was trying to do more than this with these models. And, you know, it's not a very objective process. It was really, I was sort of hacking around with code for a long time, and I think my personal preference of like things that I like to see maybe crept into that as like a meta heuristic for this whole process. So I spent weeks writing code and looking at the outputs that were being generated, and so it was an interesting kind of process for making art. I didn't really for a long time think it would fit into the PhD that I was doing. But the outputs are not very easy to control, they're quite esoteric, and I could never repeat the same thing twice, which, you know, if you're trying to build actually something's going to be useful for other people, that's kind of important, you know, you need things that can be repeatable. So I started to think after that, I started to think, okay, maybe how could I do something which would give you the same results every time, but still along the lines of training a model without data, but this time I was thinking, okay, what if we take a model that has been already pre-trained and then we fine-tune it? And I thought we could use another neural network to do that fine-tuning, and that way you've got an optimization process which is, you know, going to the same place every time, there or thereabouts. So this time I was working with StyleGAN again, StyleGAN 1, and I was thinking a lot about this, and I started to think, okay, our generator is trying to trick the discriminator into producing real things, but the discriminator has also got this, you know, its own sort of perceptual capabilities. It's looking for things very specific in the data, and we don't really know what it's looking for when it's looking for fake things, like what are those predictions, what do they look like? So I started to think, okay, we'll take a model that's already been trained, so you've got the generator and discriminator that are frozen, and then we'll not make any changes to the discriminator, but we'll start fine-tuning the generator towards producing fake data, fake outputs, and see what happens. And this process was one that kind of was a reinforcing cycle. So you know, the generator predicts something that looks fake, that you optimize the generator to do that, and it just is a sort of feedback loop, essentially. So the predictions become more and more negative, and kind of you get these exploding loss gradients, and with that you then you get very quickly like a mode collapse in the model. Those massive gradients kind of wash out all of the subtle variations and things, delicate balance of what's happening of the weights in a network. But again, this is something that happened in about 5 minutes. It was, you know, it was a very quick process. And so I did this originally with various checkpoints of like different resolutions of the model that were available. just to see what would happen. And each one was quite different, mainly because the discriminator is always, the generator and discriminator are just in this constant sort of back and forth game of what's generating telltale signs to look fake and what the discriminator is looking for at any given time is changing a lot. So this is just like a very arbitrary snapshot, but it is a way of optimizing in a very specific way towards some model of unlikelihood. And what was quite interesting was that if you take not the images at the end weren't that interesting, you kind of got this mode collapse again, which is something that I didn't want, kind of defeats the point a bit of these neural networks. But if you take a sort of earlier snapshot, kind of halfway through the process, you got these images that were really kind of uncanny and unsettling and disturbing. And in the original paper that I wrote about this, I wrote a paper called Amplifying the Uncanny. We sort of made this argument that this approach was able to generate these images that really elicited this very strong emotional response. And actually, if you sort of reverse the process, flip it on its head, it maps on very closely to this idea of the uncanny valley, which was originally proposed by a robotics professor in the 70s. It's, but in games and VFX is a common thing. So the idea is that things that don't look anything like humans, people just feel very neutral about. But the closer you get, things that look a bit like humans, you might have a certain level of fondness to. But when you get pretty close to what people look like, but not exactly realistic, then all of a sudden you're eliciting these very strong emotions where people are like, oh, get away, But then you go, if you're able to cross the uncanny valley, then you're able to, people just look at the images and think they're just purely realistic and, again, don't have that strong negative response. So, these StyleGAN images are so realistic that they're completely on this side of the uncanny valley, but by optimizing towards this idea of fakeness, you can very quickly go into this zone. So I made this series of artworks, which were just one of the snapshots of these models, and wrote this paper that I was talking about, making that argument. And the funny thing was, when I'd originally done this, I'd showed these images to my partner at the time, and she was like, "That's absolutely horrifying. Like, never show that to me again." And then the next day, I showed it to a colleague in my PhD office, who sat next to me, and she just exact same response. "That's absolutely horrifying. Like, never show that to me again." And so I'd done this in May 2019, and then it wasn't until about December that I was going back through my kind of hard drive, and I was like, "Oh, this is actually quite an interesting thing. There's something interesting here." But originally when I did this, I was just like, "Oh, I've done something terrible. Like, I'm just gonna sort of hide that away." And again, for all these experiments, I had to rerun them again last summer because of disk drive failures and not recording all the data that I should have at the time. So I reran this code, and then something that I did as this sort of more recent experiment was in this experiment, you got this kind of explosion, into sort of, massive amounts of numbers in the loss function, this kind of exponential feedback loop. So I had this idea, I was like, what if we take the log of it, try and get rid of the exponent, put the loss in log space. This had this sort of unintended consequence of the system is trying to tend towards negative numbers, just because the predictions of things being fake would be in that space. But if you take log of a negative number, it's undefined. So you're then optimizing it towards something that it can't really get to. So that kind of just goes on forever. So it sort of bounces around, going on forever. So this process would go on. And was actually quite interesting to sort of look at it. This was over 100,000 iterations. This is probably over the course of 24 hours of training. And it didn't really seem to stop. So that was something that I did last summer as part of the PhD, and actually I ended up a couple of weeks ago making a new artwork in that original unstable equilibrium series where I was training the models without data. This time I used the same training process, but just on a model that was randomly initialized, and this is a sort of video of that process of training happening over time. And so it's using that kind of frozen weights of the discriminator, trying to optimize towards it, but as it gets closer, it then can't reach it. So it's this constant process of something being optimized towards something that mathematically doesn't make sense. And this goes on for like, this will go on forever and ever. But again, you know, surprisingly tasteful. So this wasn't really an output from the PhD, but using kind of something that was developed in it. So this was, again, an interesting process. There was definitely fine-tuning these models with other models was definitely a way to push them away from the original data that they've been trained on. And my approach using the discriminator was just one particular one. There have been other people who've taken this approach of using models to fine-tune other models. The most famous example is called StyleGAN NADA, where they use CLIP to do this. And so you can just use a text prompt, and then you can fine-tune a model towards a specific text prompt. Something that I wanted to do and was not well enough to when CLIP came out. So I got scooped by some other researchers, but that really showed that the approach has more legs. But in my training, you know, I was able to repeat this. You know, you would get pretty similar results every time you run the training process, but it was very kind of idiosyncratic, especially using the discriminator model. There's more chairs in 120, if you want. Yeah. Okay, fine. All right. So it was interesting, but I didn't really feel like I had any creative control over the process. You know, it's an interesting experiment. You know, you can talk about it, but it's not something that, again, is that particularly useful, I would have thought, for other people. So I started thinking, how can I have more control over this? I actually tried training a GAN myself, like with just putting in the numbers of the loss function. Didn't work. Funnily enough, I didn't have the patience really to do that well enough. But I was thinking, like, how can we have more control over this process? How could I guide it in some way or do this? And I had a supervision meeting with Mick in 2019 where we were discussing some of these experiments, and Mick said something along the lines of like, oh, it's all great, but I just want to stick my hand inside the network and squeeze it and see what kind of comes out the other end. And I was like, that makes absolutely no sense. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. But it kind of stuck with me, and it was rattling around in my brain for a couple of months. And eventually I sort of got to this point where I sort of thought through how that could work, how you could sort of get your hand inside something and start to mess around with it. And the third experiment in the PhD was looking at how can we directly manipulate these internal features inside a network. So, of models that have already been trained. So, you know, the whole approach is sort of getting away from this idea of imitation-based learning, but, you know, to do interesting things, I've ended up relying on these models that have been trained on lots of data and have interesting features and have interesting, useful things as part of them. So, the formulation that we came up with that I was able to get working was, what if we take a neural network, we take it apart, and then we insert new layers inside the network, which are filters, essentially. So, you know, like an audio effects filter or a Photoshop filter that does something that can then be deterministically controlled by a person. So, quite a simple idea. It wasn't simple to implement. Taking networks apart in Python, you know, using these machine learning models was took a long time to figure out how you would do that in a way that was kind of flexible and controllable. So I spent I did some simple experiments, kind of hacking it with code, and then eventually I figured out what worked, what didn't, and then I took a step back and then rebuilt the whole thing as a proper library that people could use, and that process took about a year to do. So this was definitely the most significant kind of time commitment in this. And most of the work I'm going to show you is doing experiments on StyleGAN 2, which had just come out at that time. So I really wanted to sort of give as much creative control to people as possible. So I wanted to make this framework as flexible as possible. So I implemented as many different filters as I realistically could. That was able to be done in PyTorch. And so I did simple numerical ones, but also affine transformations, so things like rotation, scaling, translation, X and Y. Simple things to do that you're doing like Photoshop or something like that. And then I implemented a couple of morphological transformations, so erosion and dilation on the pixels. And I wanted to make it as flexible as possible, so you could insert any filter into any layer of the network. And on the left, you can see different filters being applied into different layers of the network, and the different things that you can get from that across all the features in the layer. But these networks also sometimes they'll have 500 convolutional features in a layer, something like that. So you could do it to everything in a layer, but actually, initially I started messing around with randomly picking a random selection of that, so 50%, 20%, seeing what happened. And through that process, I started to observe that occasionally you picked a random subset of the features and it would suddenly control something that looked like, that you could really perceive as being semantically meaningful. So then I did this clustering, which I'll talk about in a second, and then also you can combine lots of different transforms throughout the network. So after I kind of kept this all under wraps for about a year, because I wanted to get the paper out there first before really telling people what I was working on. But after that, then I shared this series of artworks, Teratome, which again, a lot of them were from these very early experiments where I was like hand coding this and applying these kind of transformations in the very early layers of the network that really disrupted what the network was doing, but then left everything else to generate as normal. So the network would have this very destructive kind of intervention early on, but then it would just generate as normal. So you had these very photorealistic images, but all the spatial structures all messed up. I'm now going to talk about the clustering algorithm. So another big part of this research was trying to, as I said, when you applied this random thing, you would see that occasionally, lots of things would be manipulated in one go. So I came up with an idea of trying to group sets of features together within a layer. And the way that I approached this was looking at the activation map. So every convolutional feature has this activation map. And if you actually look at them, you can really kind of see what it probably is doing, especially in something like faces that are very easy for our brains to sort of understand. So if you look inside one of the layers, probably I think in like layer 3, you get all these features with these like 2 dots kind of just above the center. And so that seemed pretty clear to me that these features were all responsible for eyes in some way. So the idea was, if we can group these all together based on what they look like in similarity, then that will then give us a grouping that, if we manipulate it, might do something interesting. So I did this by training a CNN classifier for every layer of the network with this kind of very small bottleneck, which I then used as a feature embedding. And then I did k-nearest neighbor clustering on top of that to group these sets of features together. And in every layer of the network, you'd get, sometimes a group of features didn't really seem to be doing very much. And I think there is a lot of redundancy in these networks. But there would definitely be at least 1 or 2 of the clusters would be really, really something that you could tangibly understand what it was doing if you manipulated it. I did some follow-up work after this original research on audio. So I'm not going to talk too much about the approach, but I trained the variational autoencoder on spectrograms, and I used the exact same clustering algorithm without any changes to the implementation, and it was able to do the same thing. So this clustering algorithm definitely worked in multiple domains. Obviously, it was a 2D CNN, and spectrograms, you can interpret them as images. So it's not generalizable outside of that type of network with convolutions in 2D, but at least it was something that could work on audio and images. And so, yeah, this is some audio that I've put in. I've reconstructed it a bit like the way I did with the Blade Runner. And then here's a cluster that, if you kind of erode it, will dampen some of these like mid-range frequencies, and if you dilate it, then it really expands them. Another thing that was an interesting example of the clustering algorithm was, I was talking about eyes, and this, in one of the layers, you'd have all of these features that were controlled eyes, and if you turn them off, you would just generate images where people didn't have eyes. Still had a bit of eyelashes going on, so obviously there was different networks that did hair. But then I had this like stupid idea at like 2 in the morning one night, and I was like, oh, what if I turn off all the images other than the ones that generate eyes? And this is what you got out. It was like this really pretty horrifying image. So I then did a latent space interpolation of this and made this video, which is just, it's sort of cycling through all of the different images of people in StyleGAN. But obviously you can't see their faces, you only see their eyes. And then the model's just kind of filling in the gaps around that. And so you get this like sort of strange textural thing. So this was an artwork. It's not really been exhibited anywhere, but it's one that is a really good illustration of what you can do with network bending that you couldn't do with anything else. And one of the criteria for my sort of personal criteria when I was doing a lot of this research was, if I'm able to come up with an algorithm that can generate something that would just not be possible to generate any other way, this would take you forever to do in After Effects, then that's kind of something that's sort of novel and unique. So that was my kind of internal metric, and I think this really kind of sums that up better than most of the other things I've shown. In 2020, when I was working on this stuff, I had some friends who had a band, and they were looking at the stuff I was posting on Instagram, and they were like, oh, this is really interesting. Do you think you could make some artworks for our EPs that are coming up? And I was like, yeah, sure. I'm doing this network bending stuff. It'd be a fun way of just trying it out and putting this together. So they had these press shots done by their record label, and they gave me these. Something that you could do with StyleGAN was take a photo of someone and then find the closest match to that person in latent space. And so that's through this kind of optimization process. So we did this, we found the closest match in latent space, and then I started taking those latents and then just doing network bending on them and seeing if we could get images that were based on them, but all messed up in some ways. So I spent a few days on this, came up with these images that I was really happy with, really compelling, and my friends from the band were like, this is great, this is really fantastic, but we're a synth pop band, we're not like a goth emo band, and this is a little bit too emo and goth for us. So I was like, okay, I don't think there's anything I can do any differently, because the images that you give me are very dark, it's black and white images, the photographer like scratched the film and stuff. So I was like, why don't you take a picture in front of like a nice colourful painting, something like that, and then we'll try that, and that should give us this. So they took these photos in front of the painting, put that in latent space, and then again went through this process of doing lots of transforms. I would generate like 100, pick my favourite 10, show it to them, and then they would say, okay, we like this one, and this one, and then that informed me to do more experiments. And we did this back and forth, and eventually ended up with these 5 artworks for their EPs. I then, in my own time, thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun to do this on myself? So I took a photo of myself, put that in StyleGAN latent space, and then did the same kind of lots of random transformations as I'd done to make these artworks, but toned it down a little bit. And this was the video that ended up. So each individual image kind of, hopefully I would say, doesn't look too much like me. But then, But then when you watch it in sort of real time, I think, you build an image in your mind that does kind of represent me, but then each frame individually all look a bit different, So that was something I just had posted on Instagram, but a year later, Luba Elliott, who runs the Creative AI meetups, was organising like an online exhibition for this gallery, Feral File, that Casey Ray set up. And the exhibition was called Reflections in the Water, and she wrote these curator's notes that got shared with us a few months before the exhibition so that we could find art that sort of, some art that we had that fitted with it. And I thought it was really interesting, you know, it's like working with AI sometimes feel like gazing into a pond of water, and, you know, you're getting kind of these reflections of yourself that are a bit distorted and turbulent. And she was really talking about kind of early GAN art, which had lots of artifacts and this kind of thing. Obviously, the direction of travel was towards just like hyperrealism with these models. So I thought this was great, and then I thought, wouldn't it be funny to try and make an artwork that this was like almost an exact description of for the curator's notes. So she was obviously talking quite metaphorically, but I thought, I'm going to try and make something that looks like a reflection of myself in water using network bending. So I took a similar approach. This time I kind of dialed down the, is this video? Yeah. Dialed down the distortion, and I actually only did kind of ablation. So I did, you know, random ablation of the features, but to get this kind of more smooth, continuous motion between the frames, I generated like Perlin noise over time in the kind of convolutional feature space of a layer. It was quite a complicated thing to do, but using this kind of mathematical noise over a certain time frame, you were then getting this ablation on certain features that was a more smooth thing that looked more like motion. And so I was trying to make something that, yeah, if you watch the whole thing, you could see an image of myself, but each individual frame would not have my sort of full form recognition of it. So those are some of the artworks I've made with network bending that I think illustrate the different things you can do with it. Oh. In 2020, a friend from my PhD program, Sebastian Burns, who's done a little bit of work at UAL as a lecturer, wrote this paper, Bridging Generative Deep Learning and Computational Creativity. And in it, he kind of coined this term, active divergence. So he was looking at, you know, what artists were doing with generative deep learning and what computational creativity researchers were looking at. And he said that this idea of like trying to get these networks to diverge from data rather than imitate it in an active way, in a sort of deliberate and controlled way, was a sort of common goal that would be relevant to this. And this term, active divergence, really had summed up what I'd been trying to do in a much more succinct way than I was able to do myself. So I then, after doing all the experimental work, I was like, oh, I should write a kind of survey on this and really flesh out this definition, because this is really the thing that I'm doing. And I'm really thankful for Sebastian for coming up with that term, because it really helped me define the research and bring it together in a really coherent way that I was struggling with before that. So I built on his definition, come up with a more sort of formal mathematical way of defining it, and then came up with this taxonomy of methods, of these 8 different methods. So training without data, divergent fine-tuning, network bending, but there's lots of other approaches, you know, rewriting models, and other ways of training models to be more divergent, and blending models together and training models together. So this survey was a lot of artist works, a lot of creatives who've been working with AI, doing really innovative stuff, as well as more traditional researchers in AI and computational creativity. So this was a survey that I did. Sebastian and his supervisor Simon were co-authors on the paper and helped me a bit with the framing of it. But one of the things that helped me realise was actually, of all the work that I'd done, had done these 3 different categorical contributions to this. So I was the first person to have published peer-reviewed research for all of these methods. Probably the first to have done it outright, but that's harder to prove. So that was very useful. And so I did this survey at the end of my PhD, quite an unusual thing to do, but it didn't make sense for me to define it at the start because the definition hadn't existed. And a lot of this work was happening concurrently with my own. So just for the structure and the sort of make it kind of like a coherent narrative, I put the survey at the end and included all my work in the survey. So I'll try and be quick. So after that, in the PhD, I then talk about the impact of the work. So the original unstable equilibrium artworks that I talked about at the beginning, in 2019, they won the grand prize in the IEEE International Conference on Computer Vision Art Gallery. They were then also shown in commercial galleries, so I was selling prints of these works on like metallic prints, and also the video works have been shown in exhibitions. So most notably it was shown at File Festival, which is the premier digital arts festival in South America. So I was shown in Brazil, and I talked a lot about the artworks made with network bending that I did. Lots of other artists have used network bending as well and developed it further. So Hans Brouwer did like audio-active style GAN and used network bending there. Jen Sykes from CCI used it in her artistic practice, and Derek Schultz is an artist who's done that as well. Another notable thing that network bending influenced was the development of the next generation of style GAN models. So style GAN 3 was built around network bending as a principle. So it was built to, essentially I kind of showed all of these weird artifacts that it generated, which I thought were interesting. The researchers at NVIDIA thought that they were a problem and tried to tried to get rid of them. So they kind of built a whole new architecture for generation where they were more invariant to these transformations inside, but they used it as a way of evaluating the models and used it a lot in a sort of public presentation of that and cited the work as well. And then lots of people have also built user interfaces around network bending. So NVIDIA did, Jasper did as well, and there's an OOLUM project from Simon Fraser University, and other people have done this in music and that kind of thing. And actually, last year we had 3 master's students all develop network bending into new kinds of models that had never been done before and built user interfaces around them, which is very impressive because I didn't get around to doing that in my PhD. So yeah, Garen Curtis, Dan Hearn and Daniel Mance all did network bending in diffusion models and audio generation, VAE models. And a team of researchers at URCAM are currently developing a library called TorchBend. They've been working on it for the last 2 years, which will allow you to do network bending on any model in PyTorch. And it's very, very impressive work. So it's not quite ready to be shared publicly, but I've been chatting to them and they're doing some really interesting stuff there. And so just to sort of reflect on the research, hacking, I think, this approach to hacking, trying to play with the technology, trying to break it and do push these things into unexpected directions, trying to do things where I couldn't predict what would happen was the real kind of driving goal that informed the research. And actually my own personal aesthetic judgment was a really key instrument in driving that. Again, trying to find things that couldn't be made any other way was really the goal for me. And so lots of people sort of frame generative AI as this autonomous creative actor in its own right, or co-creative partners. And something that I've written about recently is I was definitely treating AI more as a material to play with and just see what's possible if you poke and prod and tweak it. In a recent paper, I sort of said that this is an approach as well. Artistic approaches are ways of explaining and understanding AI in a critical way. So I'll be quick about this, but I wrote a paper last year called Using Generative AI as an Artistic Material, a hacker's guide that was in Nick's Explainable AI workshop. And I categorized ways that artists can hack AI models into 4 categories. So subverting the data that goes into the network that's been trained, manipulating in the training process, messing around with the weights and corrupting them, or kind of hacking the computational graph, the flow of computations within a network and intervening in that process. And I'll not talk over all of these, but there's lots of different artists doing very interesting things that I think really give us insight into what these networks are doing and how they work under the hood through creative practice. So I think when I started my PhD, I was telling people I was interested in doing things where I'm training generative AI, not imitating data. I mean, and people were just like, why the hell are you doing that? That's a complete waste of time. I had many conversations at the biggest AI conference in the world, NeurIPS, in 2019, where people were just like, you're wasting your time, that's pointless. And when I tell people what my PhD is about now, they don't have that response. I think people are starting to understand why just imitating other people's work is problematic. You know, it's really causing a lot of problems and tensions. So I think AI at the moment and for a long time is very heavily influenced by these like ideologies of techno-optimism and techno-determinism, which can be quite hard to break out of and talk about things in a different way. And obviously now with the expansion of generative AI and the amount of data being used to train these models without consent is really causing problems with this crisis of consent and backlash against this, you know, industrial scale intellectual property theft that all of these companies are engaging in. And, you know, building models that imitate the data that we already have and just reproduce it, I think really holds a risk of stagnating kind of cultural development and, you know, locking us into sort of things that existed at a certain period of time and, you know, we're not progressing any further beyond that. And so just, you know, the work that I've been trying to do is really escaping these paradigms and really trying to sort of find a way where we are not basing all of our development and progress on just stealing people's IP and work and deriving value from it without consent, but also finding ways of, you know, placing authorship and power and that kind of thing back with artists and the creative professionals who are making this data. So, yeah. So the PhD is these 3 categorical contributions, but of all of them, you know, network bending is the one that's been used the most, has been the most generalizable, and actually going back to the title of the thesis, you know, I was really trying to broaden the horizons of what was possible beyond imitation-based learning, and network bending is the one that is most successful in expanding that generative space towards new possibilities. So that's the talk. These are all the papers that I published in the PhD, and thanks for listening.